Okay, we are live.
Sangait everyone. Welcome to our live stream for our coffee time on redistricting. We know that, there's lots going on in all our lives, but this is something that's really important. So we wanted to take some time to share about the Alaska redistricting process and impacts on our Alaska Native community. And myself and Wáahlaal Gíidaak are here as your hosts. And we want to welcome you to this First Alaskans Institute Coffee Time on Redistricting. And I'm going to ask Wáahlaal Gíidaak if she'd like to introduce herself.
Yeah, right. Wáahlaal Gíidaak Barbara Blake My name is Wáahlaal Gíidaak. My English name is Barbara Blake. I currently serve as the director of the Alaska Native Policy Center with First Alaskans Institute. My family is from Hikdahunglai and Thawak. I am Yak Janas. My father's people are from Chestachina. I'm Ahtna on my father's side. So thank you all for joining us. And I will pass it to Lagunai.
My name is Lagunai, Liz Medicine Crow. I am Haida and Tlingit. I come from Quen. On my Haida side, I am Eagle Chichgitne. Our crest is the hummingbird. On my Tlingit side, I am a raven, Kachadi, freshwater Marksakai salmon. And First Alaskans Institute is a statewide Alaska Native nonprofit organization and operating foundation. We have an office on the homelands of the Dena'ina people in Dagayakak, also known as Anchorage. And we also have staff working remotely from their homes and from their communities, as everyone else is, who is trying to make sure that this pandemic comes to an end. And we also want to acknowledge the territories of our Native peoples across the state. And of course, also the unceded virtual territory that we are in this evening together. And we have been hosting these coffee times over the past few years on a number of different topics. And with everything so kind of intense right now with redistricting, we wanted to take a moment to bring some folks that we've been working with on this issue and just have a conversation about what it is, how it's working, things that we need to be concerned about and watchful for as a Native community. And we're so grateful that they said yes when we asked them if they would jump in and do this with us. So I'm going to go to Shannon Magnussen first, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Jim Tucker.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? My name is Shannon Magnussen, and I am originally from McGrath, Alaska. It's where both of my parents were born and raised, and I am Athabascan and Yupik. You may have heard my name associated in the past with the Alaska Federation of Natives, as I have assisted in different outreach projects such as the census and voting, convention, and now as the AFN redistricting program manager, as well as assisting with the Navigator program that AFN has launched. We are pushing a deadline with that program, so I apologize if I have to leave a little early if something comes up in advance. But so a little bit, redistricting has by far been one of the more challenging positions regarding outreach for me, to be honest, because I'm not an expert in it. It's something that happens every 10 years, and it's just not something that you hear too much about until it's happening. With that said, it doesn't mean that I don't think it's not important. It's very important. It's just a little more challenging. Populations are fluctuating all the time, and there's significant changes in the time frame of 10 years. Populations, as you know, impact how the boundary lines are drawn and will determine how your votes count when you go to the polls. That's where the term one person, one vote comes from. All votes should have equal power within that district. The goal for AFN's redistricting project is to give Alaskans the opportunity to be involved and educated in the process. So we've been explaining terms that they may hear, sharing information so that they can be actively involved In addition to hiring 50 outreach specialists throughout Alaska who are helping push our information out, our popular pop-ups have returned. I don't know if you remember seeing them from the census, but they are back and you still have time to enter today. So it's an opportunity where Alaskans can learn things about redistricting, population, where the Alaska Redistricting Board is traveling, and like other little fun tidbits of information. They'll have a chance to win a fun prize at the same time as well. So that's a lot of fun. If you haven't checked them out, they're on the AFN webpage. So another thing that AFN has been doing is getting PSAs out and working with public radio. And we've had the opportunity with some of those radio stations to actually get the PSAs out in Alaska Native dialects of the area, which I'm really excited about. So I think it's important that Alaskans have the opportunity in this process to hear things, and maybe over and over, because that creates discussion. And I think it includes our young people as well, because if they hear it enough, they're going to ask questions. And when this is happening again in another 10 years, some of them may be of voting age and be able to participate more actively in it. So I'd like to thank First Alaskans for inviting me today and actively reaching out to me throughout the past weeks and involving me in their workshops, where I felt like, you know, I've been able to learn more and share ideas in a safe place. But thank you all for being here tonight. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, gee, Shannon. Jim?
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Jim Tucker. I'm a senior special counsel with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. For the better part of a decade, I litigated cases with NARF in Alaska. A lot of voting rights work up there to do. Before I say anything else, I really want to give a shout out to Julie Kitka. Julie is going to be testifying before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs tomorrow morning at 10:30 Alaska time. You can go on the internet, just type in a search for Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. And it's a really important hearing because she's going to be talking about one of the issues we're talking about tonight, which is voting rights in Alaska in particular. So please tune in and watch that. I'll just say redistricting is so fascinating. And for me, I've studied it for a long time because one of my first job out of law school was clerking for a federal judge, and we had a racial gerrymandering case. Was one of my first cases as a new lawyer, clerking for a federal judge. And it fascinated me so much that I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania and getting a doctorate, just looking at and studying race and redistricting. And I think one of the things that I had brought me into all of this was, you know, kind of redistricting is kind of the sexy part of voting litigation, because everyone always thinks about, oh, this changes everything. This changes district lines across the state. It affects everyone. And it's true. But one of the things I also learned in Alaska is that the bigger issue that Alaskans face every day is just the most basic barriers to being able to register to vote, to cast a ballot, to have it counted, to get language assistance. But the way that redistricting feeds into that is redistricting is your way to elect your officials who are going to be the ones that are going to be responsible for making sure that your vote can be protected. And that's one of my concerns, especially for Alaska, is given the amount of litigation we've had to bring to get the state to do the right thing and to provide language assistance to, in the case of AFN, taking the lead on getting early voting locations in the villages, trying to fight back against polling places in villages being closed and turned into permanent absentee voting. That all depends on who you get as an elected official to push back and say, no, rural Alaska has to be treated the same way that urban Alaska is, and people need to be given the same opportunities. And so for that reason, redistricting is really, really important because it really controls ultimately the people who are going to decide that. The other thing I will also just say before I turn it back over to Liz is that it ends up functioning in a way that it can actually end up suppressing the vote, because imagine yourself that you do a great job registering voters, you get out the vote, and you always turn out that every single time your candidate of choice is defeated. And the reason your candidate of choice is defeated oftentimes is because the lines have been drawn to prevent you from being able to elect your candidate of choice. And what we've actually seen in many states is that actually can suppress the vote, because people get discouraged and they just don't want to participate because they feel like their vote doesn't matter anymore. And so that's why there's been so much emphasis placed by First Alaskans, by AFN, by NARF, by other groups, the Lawyers Committee, just in terms of trying to get people to participate in the redistricting process, because it really feeds on itself. And the flip side is also true. I think one of the things that we saw a few years ago is that with the largest number of Native women ever being elected, it was just two. It's sad that it was just two, that it actually built up a lot of enthusiasm for people to turn out and vote in other elections. So for that reason, it's really, really important, not just for its symbolic value, but because it has real effects on the ability of people to elect their candidates and to participate in future elections. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Liz. Thanks.
Yeah, James. James, I called you James because I looked at the name on your Zoom square there, but I always call you Jim. Okay, we'll go to Marna and then Megan.
All right, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I had to call in on my phone because my internet is acting up at my house. So thanks for bearing with me on these technical difficulties. So thanks for having me and for putting this together. I always appreciate how First Alaskans is making sure that the conversations are having when they need to happen. So my name is Marna Sanford, and currently I am working with a coalition of groups, Doyon, Tanana Chiefs Conference, Ahtna, Sea Alaska, and Fairbanks Native Association on a third-party map that we have developed to propose to the redistricting board. And in the process of working with them on this map, have gotten, I feel Shannon, because I had no background in redistricting before. You hear about things like gerrymandering and all this kind of thing, but you don't realize that this is it. This is the one time that people are talking about. This is the instance when that happens. And holy cow, we're on the front lines, and we're the people who are potentially pushing back against some of these decisions that are being made. And I think I got it initially, but we're really in it. And that's, again, why I'm so glad we're having these conversations, is because you have one chance every 10 years to weigh in on redistricting. And for a lot of people, it may be just putting on the record what you think your community is. So that may be the actual town that you live in, but it also just may be where you shop, where you recreate, where your kids go to school, and making sure that you've told the redistricting board what defines you as a community. Because as Jim mentioned, this is kind of your one chance to make sure that the person who you have representing you in Juneau knows that neighborhood, knows that community, knows your values, and you have the power fundamentally to elect that person or not elect that person based on the way the map is drawn. So I've just been in crash course in redistricting over the last many months. I'm excited to be on the group on the conversation with these folks. So thanks for having me.
Megan.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan Condon. I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund. I wanted to thank First Alaskans for hosting this conversation and for inviting NARF to participate. I'm so happy to be here this evening. NARF has been working in a number of states, including Alaska, on redistricting efforts. The Alaska office is working to protect the political power of Alaska Natives, and we're also helping to advocate for an open, fair, and transparent redistricting process. We want to make sure that there's equity and access to the process. So we've really been pushing for multiple ways to participate, including call-in and virtual, as opposed to only limiting to in-person participation. You're the experts in your communities, and we want to make sure that there's opportunities for people to speak to their communities and what's in this process that's going to affect us for the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, thank you all for giving such good introductions of yourself and your work, and just speaking the real kind of truth about this process. I will share from my own perspective that never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would ever have to be spending any time focused on the census or redistricting or elections. I always thought that my ability to work on behalf of our Native community would show up in different ways, but it has showed up in this way. And I think for a really critical reason. Our Board of Trustees at First Alaskans Institute asked a question when I first started working for us, which was, what happens to our Native community when we think about the power of the census, voting, and redistricting on our people? And are our people in a position to really have a voice in that process, or in those processes? And what does that look like, and what does that mean? So that was about 14 years ago. And I was able to participate in the last redistricting or last census and then redistricting process. And that's really where I was learning, and I'm still learning. Unlike Jim, I have not gone to get a PhD in racial gerrymandering in the redistricting process, but boy, have I lived it. And I think we can all say that fairly, that here in Alaska, one of our biggest concerns and one of the reasons our trustees was looking at this issue is because despite the fact that we have a very large population of Alaska Natives in our own homelands, this place now called Alaska, we still don't get equitable representation in the state legislature. And we still don't get to elect people who really represent our interests on an equitable basis. And that's what redistricting really boils down to, is drawing the lines on where these districts are going to be so that you know whether you're going to be able to actually have any voice in electing someone in that district. When it comes down to it, like a kind of a basic level of what redistricting is, it's really about who within your community is going to be able to have actual power and voice by casting their vote and being able to elect someone that represents your interests, that looks like you, that comes from your experiences, that has lived and walked on your homelands and cares for it in the same way that you do, who understands the cultural connection, language, ways of life, ecosystem that makes it possible for us to have existed here and thrive here for thousands of years. And we have not had an equitable basis in the redistricting process to ever kind of even get close to allowing us to have that level of equitable representation. And so that's why it's important for us to be here and have this conversation. And I could tell you, I was just like, oh, with the census was hard to get excited about. For me, redistricting was just like calculus. And, I'm not a fan. Okay, I'll just be honest. And so it was like, why is this so complicated? It's complicated on purpose because people don't want you to have a voice and they don't want you to participate. And so some of the work that we've been doing at First Alaskans is to make it accessible to our people and to hold the system accountable to being understandable and make it respond to the people, not the other way around. And so that's kind of how we've been really focused in this work and why we wanted to have this coffee time. With Wáahlaal Gíidaak, I was hoping you might share a little bit about some of your story with this work and then about our redistricting working group.
Yeah, thank you for that, Laganai. I've been involved in this process. I'm going to tell a fun story about being excited about redistricting, and that, sorry, there's a loud thing happening here in my house, and I gotta turn it down. Loud. Okay. Sorry about that. 10 years ago during the redistricting process, I I'd been involved and I wanted to know more. I was an undergrad in college and still figuring out, all of this stuff, and just really piqued my interest. I know that redistricting doesn't get a lot of people excited, but for whatever reason, I was really interested in what was going to happen. And I was going on this date with this young man, and he and I were driving to a concert. And to get into this concert, I had to show my ID. And on the way out there, I was like, "Oh no, I forgot my ID." But we were talking about redistricting the whole time. And so he said, "Well, you know what? Since we have to drive back, I have the redistricting, the draft maps in my office. We could just go grab a bottle of wine and go look at those and have a chat about them." And I was like, "Yes, let's do that. That sounds way better than a concert." Nerd alert. Yeah. But that was a really sad redistricting process. It was pretty heartbreaking to watch Senator Albert Kukesh be removed from his position after serving most of our rural communities for so long, and in such a great way, to really care about our Native people as a Native man himself, and to see his replacement kind of be split up by two non-Native people who really couldn't care less about our communities or our Alaska Native communities as a whole. And so, the passion really just grew from there, watching all of that unfold and watching that the process unfold in the way that it did. And so First Alaskans has been hosting since we first got the census data, or actually before the census data was released, an Alaska Native Redistricting Work Group. And in that Alaska Native Redistricting Working Group, just serving as a place for folks to be able to talk, to share information, to learn, to engage, to identify areas where advocacy is needed, to support each other as necessary. We've really been meeting almost weekly since the census was coming to a close, and really providing for each other what is necessary to move the ball in terms of representation, as Marna was mentioning, as others mentioned, for our Alaska Native people and our Alaska Native communities. So we also have some other things in the works, but we're going to save those announcements for another day.
Yeah, goodness, sheesh, how Wáahlaal Gíidaak. I mean, I feel like a movie. The redistricting love story needs to be made now. That wins the prize for best redistricting story I think I've ever heard so far. So with our special guests, I would pose this question and give you each a chance to respond. When we're trying to make sure that our Native community, and even our Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color population in Alaska, who some of these issues will really be relevant to, and it makes a lot of sense because the issues are really connected in a lot of ways. What are some of the things that you really want to make sure that people understand and know about the process to make it more accessible to them? So is there anything that you have heard or that you have seen and experienced, or that you'd like to share everyone, just to help them get a better footing and an understanding on this redistricting process in Alaska?
I guess I'll go. As a segue, because I think it's a logical segue, we all want it to be a redistricting love story and not a redistricting horror story, which it could be, because I think part of the problem with the way Alaska has set it up is it's on such a short time frame. And the thing that, all of us who work with, the villages know that you can't get stuff done quickly, because getting information in and out of the villages and getting support, getting, statements, getting people to state their views and what's important to their village, it takes time. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is just geographic distance. Some of it is language. Some of it is there are, other things going on in their lives. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so difficult going into this, is that the deck almost seems stacked against rural Alaska and Alaska Natives to begin with. And because of that, even though when there are efforts made by the Independent Redistricting Commission to have public hearings, the fact is it still ends up placing a big burden on the villages and on organizations such as First Alaskans, AFN, and NARF to be proactive to actually bring people to the table, because there just isn't time to get the word out, and it's difficult to recruit people who can speak for their village. And I think that's one of the things that's really unfortunate. I'll just say I understand why that may be the case, that there's always talk about, oh, we've got candidate qualifying deadlines, we have to have maps in place, we have to go. The fact is other states provide more time than Alaska does, and it just makes it so much harder for everyone. And that's why everything that Liz and Barbara and everyone else is doing on this is so important, because if it seems like you're getting lots of gentle nudges to come to the table, it's because the table is going to be cleared very quickly, and you're not going to have an opportunity to have dessert because they're already going to be done with the meal before you even get to the table. So that's why it's really, really important when people are encouraging you, definitely return the call. If you're told about a meeting coming up, attend the meeting, but be responsive, because you just aren't going to have much time otherwise.
And then add in the pandemic and its impacts. Marna?
Yeah, I think I would add just that on to exactly what Jim was saying, not just on the timeline issue, is that the nature of Alaska's geography makes the community outreach completely, in my opinion, unworkable. So they're having public meetings in Kotzebue and in Nome and in Bethel, but the places that are truly going to be impacted by the lines that are drawn are Pilot Station, they're Quinnipiac, they're McGrath, it's Grayling, Anvik. It's these communities that they're not going to get a public hearing in these small communities, and it's these micro minorities where that are basically being used, and this is sort of across the state, the Deerings, the Bucklands, these small communities that are being used as filler to make sure that districts fit according to this population quotient. And so one of the things that, I'm trying to make sure people know is that, you've got to get something on the record with where you want to be, and the outreach that we're doing, right? Everybody's so excited about the Alaska Redistricting Board website, which I think they did a really wonderful job. Everybody on this call knows what this website and how much memory it uses loads like in, wherever it may be, rural Alaska to be named, right? I mean, all of our communities that we work in on a daily basis, this website is almost useless to them because of the amount of bandwidth that is required to download one map, let alone 6. The wonderful tool that they have to be able to create your own districts, that will never work in Beaver, Alaska, not in a real practical sense. And so we have the work of not just asking people to get involved, but all of these tools we've been given feels like we're back, 20 years where we've sending out paper maps, asking people to figure out a way to get engaged on something that is almost entirely inaccessible to them. And so, adding to that, I just, it has been a challenge. It has been rewarding in the folks that have come to the table. I know 10 years from now, if I'm still around, I'm going to start a year in advance.
Yeah, goodness, geez, Marna. Shannon or Megan?
So yeah, I understand the frustration because it's just hard, and that goes for a lot of the outreach that I've done. And people don't understand it. I mean, in some of our outreach, we are sending faxes. People still get that, and they get it. That's how they, how they receive a lot of information, and they get it. So that's like something that we've had to do in the past as well. And we do have the statewide call-in for those places that are not being visited. And what we're trying to do right now with public radio is really get that information out so that and try to get people to call in for that. You know, if the redistricting board is not making it to your community, please call in, you know, during that time. And we're keeping that information on Facebook because it seems like a lot of people are scrolling Facebook. So we try to keep a lot of stuff on there where they'll see it. So that's kind of where we're at with that situation. But yes, it's definitely a challenge getting the information out there.
Do you have a number that people can call? Do you have a statewide call number, Shannon, that you wanted to share with everyone?
We do. Let me pull it up.
Okay. No worries. Well, Megan, did you want to share anything? And then Shannon can share the number and we'll just keep making sure we mention it.
Yeah, sure. I think I would echo what a lot of folks have already said about how the redistricting process, there's a combination of kind of by design barriers that make it difficult to participate. And then there's also, I think, sort of just everyday realities. So when we think about some of these community meetings, not having a call in, not only is that problematic in light of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, but also folks in surrounding communities that can't, there's travel related barriers. So having something like a call in at not just one statewide, but at those individual community and regional meetings would be one way that we could start taking down some of those barriers, which could go a long way when we have so many sort of barriers compacting and reinforcing each other.
Yeah, I appreciate that because having the ability to hear the comments that are being made during the hearings that are being held across the state, being able to hear what the community is saying really impacts the way that other people, other advocates, other organizations like those you represent are us at First Alaskans, gets us a better insight into the community and what the community cares about. And we can't hear that, so we can't address it or respond to it in regards to analyzing how the maps may or may not achieve it, the current draft maps that are available for people to check out on the alaska-redistricting.org website. And having the ability to hear those concerns or how a community thinks about itself is critical because that gets to some of the requirements that the redistricting board must meet, right? And under the state constitution, they have to meet compactness, contiguity, and integrated socioeconomic communities, right? And those are big words that they may not make a lot of sense, but I guess the easiest way for me to say it is like, you know, and you define the boundaries of your community and your neighbors can know and define the boundaries of their community. And it kind of collectively makes sense together. And so that's what compactness and contiguity means. That you're not like, this community here is like stretched all the way across to a completely other regional area of Alaska where they have nothing in common with each other. But rather they can be whole and within each other as much as possible. And then the socioeconomic integration really speaks to, are these the same kind of people? Are they showing up in the same kind of way when they're doing their day-to-day work or when they're showing up at the polls? And to me, this is really critical. This is about, can you elect people who represent your interests? And our Native community and other communities of color here in Alaska, these are socioeconomic issues. And it becomes complicated when people try to make socioeconomics not inclusive of those real aspects of community. And so I wanted to kind of open this space up around those state constitutional requirements. And then just to kind of give you a preface, where we'll move into some of the federal things that we need to think about too. But I just kind of wanted to open up this space and ask if anyone wanted to share your thinking about the state requirements and where we are in the process with the redistricting board.
I guess I will kick it off again. The other thing that what Liz said is just so insightful, because the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that part of the reason why some of the state requirements are set up the way they are is they're supposed to be able to ensure that you can have kind of like communities with like interests combined together. And all you have to do is look at Alaska. I mean, would it make sense to say that you want to have a representative from North Slope that also represents all the way down to southwestern Alaska? No, because they have very different interests. And I think one of the other concerns that I always have when I look at, when I look at how the lines are being drawn, how they've been drawn in the past, is that the other problem Alaska faces is that so much of the population is actually concentrated in urban areas. And you end up seeing, I mean, you're basically having representatives from urban parts of the state deciding what's going to be in the best interests of people in rural Alaska. And it just doesn't make sense. I mean, do you really want, legislators from, Fairbanks, Juneau, or Anchorage deciding whether or not, like what the length of fishing season is going to be, whether or not you're going to allow sports fishermen and hunters to come into traditional lands? No, I mean, the answer is no. You just don't get good results that way. And it also, the flip side of it is that a lot of the very distinct needs that you see in rural Alaska oftentimes just simply aren't being represented at the state level. One of the things that's always fascinated me about one of the most important things that's happened in the villages in the last 30 years has been the ability to have airstrips, just have the gravel airstrips so that, planes can get in and out. Well, most of that actually came from federal funding. And it's largely because there are things that should have been done by the state a long time ago. But just again, because of how underrepresented rural Alaska has been through the years, that, sometimes it just simply reached where you ended up having a cry out from the villages that we really need this to be connected, to be able to get, our elders in for healthcare services, to be able to get our mail. We need to have a way to get reliable services. And unfortunately, so much of that was done at the federal level, largely because, again, how the state lines were drawn.
I would say that there's been two interesting things based on some of the things Jim was saying that I've come across in this process. The first was when we were talking to the different groups and board members about how they were configuring a lot of the smaller communities in rural Alaska. And there was a little bit of an inference that one rural legislator was better for you than the legislator of your choosing. And I'm not sure how to iterate that quite well enough, but the idea that the lower Yukon and the upper Yukon are very different, and that the legislator who may be a friendly legislator, who may understand rural Alaska, is better for the upper Yukon than somebody that they get to choose. I don't know, to me that is just sort of part of that same narrative that all Alaskan Natives are the same and that they all have the same issues and you should be happy with what we give you. It's sort of that same sort of idea that came across very early on. One of the things that the redistricting board had to deal with on like day 2 was how to handle Cordova. They decided to start drawing down in southeastern Alaska, and they realized really quickly that there wasn't enough population in the southeast to fill out all the districts. So they got to the town of Cordova, and the only way to have a nice round district number was to cut Cordova in half. And everybody was like, oh, we can't cut Cordova in half. We can't cut Cordova in half. The current map right now draws a line up the Richardson Highway and separates half of the Ahtna communities on one side of the road from literally their neighbor on the other side of the road. Gokana, Chistatina, Copper Center. Did anybody make that same comment for those communities? So those largely majority Alaska Native communities, where was the outrage when it came to doing that? And that's what we see, is we see that right now Matt Sioux wants nothing to do with Anchorage, even though there's a court case that says that that their two boroughs can live together and have the same similar urban type ideas and priorities, and they are up in arms about it. And yet when you talk to them about putting McGrath in with Nome, people are like, oh, but you guys are fine. It's fine. And I guess, again, it's that sentiment that we all have to push against, that what's good for urban Alaska is not good for rural Alaska. We are not a monolith. And we just have to keep making sure people understand that all across Alaska, throughout all parts of the process.
Yeah, goodness, geez, Jim and Marna. Megan, were you gonna share something as well?
I guess I would, I'm just excited about this conversation. I get really hyped up after what Marna just said. So I really appreciate that. And I guess I would just really emphasize that, like I said, you're the expert in your communities. When you hear these narratives that you know are different than what you're experiencing, I hope that folks will push back on those and speak on what their communities look like, what's best for their communities, talk about what is important to their communities, and ultimately defining your community helps to make sure that you're able to hold your representative accountable and that it's someone that will understand your interests. So I know that this can be a daunting process. This can be an overly technical process by design. But when it comes down to it, I think that, like I said, you're the expert in your communities. I think that people should not feel like this jargon and technical language should keep them out of it, and feel empowered to tell the redistricting board about your community and what's best for your community, because you know that better than anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to be a redistricting expert to be able to provide testimony. You already are an expert in your own community and in your lived experiences. I really appreciate that. And I feel the same way. I'm like, yes, fired up. Shannon, did you want to add anything too for people to be thinking about?
No, I don't have anything additional. I just, yeah, I agree. The same thing, you know, your community is, you know, who, you know, if they're putting you with somebody way out there, is, you know, speak up. It's not wrong, you know, it's not wrong. And you're learning as you're going, ask questions. You know, like a few of us here, we're not experts, but there's no wrong answer, you know, and this is the time to be voicing and asking the questions, you know, and reaching out.
Well, great. So to that point, let's get into some of these issues. And again, to our community, you know, the work that Shannon and the AFN is doing right now to make it more accessible as well is really important. So we want to share the links on our Facebook page to everything that they're doing, because they're really making it possible for a lot of people to engage, or at least get the information so that they can be ready to engage. And you'll have until November 10th, we heard today from the redistricting board, to submit testimony, written testimony, participate in the in-person hearings that they're having, or also call in to the call-in opportunities that they'll create. So there's still time to have your voice heard and to make sure that your communities are at least protected. And your testimony does more than just tell the redistricting board what you think is important for them to hear. Your testimony is also helping create a record, because there's really not a redistricting process that happens in Alaska that doesn't go unlitigated after the redistricting map is done. And so there will likely be litigation that happens after this. And everything that's on the record in that public testimony is fair game for the courts to consider about what the redistricting board did in fairness of process, as well as whether they actually took these things into consideration to meet those constitutional requirements on the state side. The other thing they have to meet is the federal requirements of the Voting Rights Act. And I wanted to ask if Jim, if maybe you would want to share a little bit so people get an understanding of the way the process works in terms of the Voting Rights Act analysis that needs to happen. Should have been happening all along, but we'll discuss that in a moment. But just to give people a little bit of a understanding of what those federal requirements are.
Sure. So I think the biggest thing is when we look at it through the lens of the Voting Rights Act, we're looking at whether or not Alaska Natives have equal opportunities to elect their candidates of choice. And there are kind of two parts to that. One is you kind of look at the overall statewide map and the number of districts where there are equal opportunities, and then you compare it to the population. If you see a wide gulf between the two, that's indicative that there could be a problem. But the other thing that comes up very frequently is you will see individual districts where you will see, compact groups. In other words, compact is where you actually have communities that are close together. You can draw a district so it actually looks nice. It doesn't look like I was on a panel last week at the University of Baltimore, and they were talking about how one of Maryland's districts looks like a pterodactyl. So it's a really, really uncompact, non-compact, horrible-looking district. Something that is compact would be like if you had a square. A square is like a very, very compact district. And one of the things you will look at is how are the communities being put together, or are they being divided? Are you, and it's, in Alaska, it's easy to see ways in which you can keep those communities together where there are common interests. Inland villages have very different interests and needs oftentimes than coastal areas. One of the other things you see is that, do you want to have a district where you have, 4 different Alaska Native languages spoken, or is it possible that you can keep all of the, Central Yupik speakers together in a single district so that a representative can actually represent them? Are the communities antagonistic towards one another? Sometimes they are. Do you want to place them together? And so what you end up looking at when you're looking at especially the individual district is, are you taking groups of people who should be communities that should be placed in the same district, and you're splitting them up and putting them into different districts? And then the other part of it is you also look at voting patterns. Are you seeing, an instance, for example, where this is going to be especially true where you have, a district that's going to be fairly close to like 50-50 between Alaska Natives and non-Natives. And you look at voting patterns and see, are the non-Natives voting for the same candidates the Natives are? And most of the time the answer is no, because the voting in Alaska tends to be very racially polarized. And where that happens, where you end up seeing communities split and communities that should be placed together being literally driven apart, that's a sign that there could be an issue under the Voting Rights Act. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. They use what's called the Totality of the Circumstances test. And the reason why they do that is because every community is different, every district is different, and you really have to look at the situation on the ground. And that's why everything that Marna is doing, for example, in terms of helping draw maps, they're taking that into consideration. What AFN is doing, working with NARF, they're trying to keep similar communities together and trying to get similar communities to work together so they can try to be in the same district. And that's basically what compliance with the Voting Rights Act is, that you want to give equal opportunities to elect.
Oh, goodness, sheesh. So earlier I had talked about the state requirements, and then also just now we heard about the federal requirements. One of the things that we heard from the redistricting board early on in the process was that they weren't going to pay any attention to the federal requirements until maps were already drawn and they were pretty much already done, and they were just going to do the analysis on that. And they were in fact thinking about just the state constitutional requirements. However, they weren't thinking about, like for instance, our Native community in the socioeconomic integration requirement, and they were discluding that from actual mapping. They didn't include it in the public version of the redistricting software so that people could do that themselves, and they weren't allowing people to really talk about it. And so I'm wondering if you folks have any thoughts about why that might be and why that's problematic.
I guess I have a couple thoughts. I think what the redistricting board kind of used as their justification for looking at the Alaska constitutional requirements first and really postponing consideration of the federal requirements was a past Alaska Supreme Court case that does instruct the redistricting board to first look at the state constitution requirements when drawing the lines, and then make adjustments based on the federal requirements. That doesn't mean that they need to wait till the very end of the process to look at the federal requirements, but it's kind of been this process of looking to the state constitution first has been used as a justification to really postpone thinking about the federal requirements until the end of the process, which in the end, I think it undermines an open and transparent process because the public isn't able to have the opportunity to provide input on whether it be the VRA analysis, the Voting Rights Act analysis, or any adjustments that might need to be made to maps to comply with federal requirements. So I think pointing to this case has been the rationale, but I don't think that it justifies waiting till so late in the process and really does undermine the public's ability to participate fully and fairly. And I would also say intentionally, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Liz, I just wanted to point out the other thing that Megan's not saying that's really important is, did you see how excited she got? The reason why Megan got excited is because this is a recipe for NARC to have litigation against the state of Alaska, and Megan's getting really excited about that.
I would also just say intentionally not looking at race data is not a justification or not a defense to not complying with federal requirements. So ignoring that information is not a defense, and I think ultimately it's not going to result in equitable maps.
Well, and isn't there also Alaska Supreme Court precedent that talks about looking at Alaska Native communities specifically when you're determining the integrated socioeconomic aspects of a community?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court looks at a number of factors when it's looking at the socioeconomic integration. And one of the things that it has looked to is what they've referred to as kind of whether an area is predominantly Alaska Native. It's not required for the board to look at that, but it's certainly permissible for them to. And so this idea that it's prohibited, I don't think is reasonable.
Anyone else want to jump in on this and share your thoughts about it?
I think I would add that a lot of the focus of the board has been partly because we've kind of demanded that they look at rural Alaska in this regard. And there's been a lot of, there has been, not just from our group, but there has been a fair amount of engagement again from some of those hub communities. However, we all know that a huge number of Alaska Native people live in Anchorage and Fairbanks. And I think that that is partly, to me, where I start to get worried. When I see the board talking about the 4 northern and western districts and just sort of, oh, those are our Alaska Native majority districts, and moving right on. And not considering that there is a huge chunk of folks in Anchorage and Fairbanks and how those people are either going to be impacted or completely disenfranchised based on how they draw their maps. And some of that is the key. When we throw around words like socioeconomically integrated, we can assume a lot about our rural communities based on cultural activities, based on ANCSA regions, regional nonprofits, et cetera. That still applies in our urban areas. And for those of us who are familiar with Fairbanks and Anchorage, in particular, we know where folks live, we know what neighborhoods they live in, we know who their legislators are. And I think that is where I am concerned that this is going to get overlooked. Don't just say, oh, we've got our 4 Alaska Native districts on the West Coast and then give it a bye, you know? That's all.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, and that gets to my next question. So an ideal district is 18,355 Alaskans, right? And we know that with the last census, Alaska Native people make up 22% of the overall state population, right? And so we also know that there are 60 seats in the state legislature that require an election, right? So how do we get to equity then? How do we create equity, knowing that we've never been able to achieve it for our Alaska Native community through the redistricting process? And we have active forces who are, you know, as you said, Marna, it's like, oh, these four are our Alaska Native districts, and so we don't have to think about anything else. But we know that we have a huge population in these other areas. How do we bridge the distance between the way people are thinking about Alaska Native populations and really what's required by our population to have equitable redistricting and equitable elections? So I was thinking about, you know, just doing some basic math. Like I told you earlier, I'm not going to do the calculus. I'm just going to do the basic math. You know, if we have 22% of the 60 seats, right? Just base population numbers, 22% of our Alaska Native population, right, in the state. If we had 22% of those 60 seats, that's over 13 seats that we should be electing. And we have 6. So what's not working? What is the problem? Like, why aren't we able to get an equitable amount of representation? Everyone else gets it and expects it. But when we work for it and fight for it, we come against huge and massive barriers like you guys outlined earlier. So I'm just hoping you might be able to shed some light on this piece of it as well. Anyone want to jump in?
I guess I'll just say a couple of things. One is, I think that oftentimes areas where there are opportunities to draw majority Alaska Native districts, they end up diluting that because they end up bringing little arms that come into the cities, come into the urban areas. And then all of a sudden, instead of electing Alaska Native, you're electing yet another non-Native. I think the other thing that's interesting about this redistricting cycle is that the number and percentage of other minority populations is increasing as well. And so I think this redistricting cycle also provides opportunities to potentially have what we call coalition districts, where you can actually have perhaps the Asian American population joining with the Alaska Native population to be able to elect a common candidate together. And, you know, sometimes people will say, well, how does that really work in practice? You'd be surprised. Oftentimes the communities will come together and they'll make a tacit agreement that, you know, if it ended up being like a 50-50 district, for example, between Asian Americans and Alaska Natives, we've seen in other places where you'll have tacit agreements between the populations that, you know, you run a, you know, your community gets to elect the representative this election cycle. Next election cycle, we get to go ahead and elect our candidate. So they're not running against each other and diluting the vote. I think the other part of it is that even though when we talk about the total population of Alaska Natives, it's 22%, but the other key metric is we have to look at voting age population, and that's it's a little over 18%. And that's the other thing that tends to work against the Alaska Native community. Is it's a much younger population than the non-Native population, and so you have to take that into account, that when you're drawing districts, you may want to make sure that you draw districts that don't just have a majority of the total population, but you also need to look at the voting age population. But you also need to look at something that I know both First Alaskans and AFN are really big on, which is the number of registered voters. You need to look at what is the political participation even among that population that is eligible to vote. And when you take all those into consideration, it's still shocking, because there is no way that that you should have less than half of what the total population is in terms of the number of seats. Even if you factored in other barriers, you've assumed that you would have at least 10 seats, 10 or 11 seats. And the fact that it's 6 really speaks volumes that the process is really not working.
Yeah, 100%, James, Jim. Yeah, it is frustrating to watch, and a little over 13 seats is definitely where equity, that sweet spot of equity lies. And if something's not working, the system needs to be revisited and something needs to be identified in figuring out how to make things equitable. And I'm thankful for all of the work that all four of you are doing to ensure that system is as equitable, at least pushing equity that much further just by doing the work that you're doing. And so thank you for that. One final question before we sign off. If I'm sitting out here in the audience watching right now, I am not a census nerd. I did not go on a census or a redistricting date with some guy. What can I do? How can I be involved? What is my goal? And what should I be thinking about in terms of my next steps in getting involved in this process?
Follow
Well, if
the
you'll allow
AFN
me,
page.
I want-
Oh,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry. And say follow the AFN page. We're constantly sharing information and just being up to date and informed on where they are, what's happening. Super important. If you can load the maps at where you are, get together with some of your community members and do that. Call in on the statewide call if they're not making it to your community. That's like really important, and it'll be on record, so come join our pop-ups, win some prizes. We're having a lot of fun with that. We always do. But yeah, get involved as you can, not for sure. Thank you.
I want to do a shout out to Fairbanks peeps. Right now, the 2 board versions of the Fairbanks map, along with the 4 third-party versions, really treat Fairbanks in some unique ways that are really, really going to influence who is going to be a representative. So if you're listening in and you're from Fairbanks, I would love to visit with you more about the map and the maps and the way it handles Fairbanks and the implications for you and your representation in Juneau. So I'll drop my email in the chat, and Wáahlaal Gíidaak can share it, and maybe we can get some people interested in commenting about Fairbanks. Thanks.
Are there any special messages we should be sharing in terms of testimony, things we should be focused on, things our people listening should be focused on?
They are having a Zoom tomorrow for Skagway. The information is, of course, on the AFN page, but it's at 12:30 Alaska Standard Time tomorrow. It is a Zoom, and there is a link there that will take you straight to the Zoom meeting. So for Skagway residents, that area, want to get that message out.
And so I guess the message, my closing message will be, you heard that the deadline's November 10th, so it's 2 weeks for the next 10 years. The next 2 weeks are going to control who your representative is for the next 10 years. So it's really, really important. Keep an eye on the Facebook, Facebook posts, keep an eye on AFN, keep an eye on First Alaskans, keep an eye on, get the maps from Marna. She promises she'll fax them to you page by page if you don't have good broadband. But you've got to get involved because the time is running out, the clock is ticking, and this determines the next 10 years.
Megan, any final thoughts or things that people should be thinking of?
I guess I would say I would put in a plug for the statewide call-in on Saturday. If there hasn't been other times that you've been able to participate, that's going to be one of kind of the final times. So if you're able to call in, I would say go ahead and take advantage of that, because as we've spoke to a lot, there's a lot of barriers to this process that are designed to keep Alaska Natives and communities of color out of the process. So if you're able to try to call in, try to send an email to the board and make your voice heard in this process.
Yeah, goodness, geez, Hawa. Yeah, I think what I would offer to our community, our Native community and our BIPOC community, and even our allies out there, if you're interested in figuring out ways to be supportive and helpful, please contact any of us. And at First Alaskans Institute, Wáahlaal Gíidaak is our lead within our Alaska Native Policy Center for our Alaska Native Redistricting Working Group. And we've had some really excellent guest speakers who have come and kind of broken down each of the different components and aspects of the redistricting process. And we want to make sure that you can access that information as well too. So reach out to us. I want to note too that something that we didn't mention at the beginning of this and really didn't get into is kind of the makeup of the redistricting board and that whole process. I know that Shannon and the AFN crew have been putting out some really good information about how that happened. So go and like the AFN page if you don't already, and be able to read in on those pop-ups, because they're giving away some of that really beautiful Native jewelry and artwork. And you get to learn a little bit about the process and the makeup of the board and all of that as well. I do want to mention that there's 5 members of the redistricting board. Melanie Banky, who is Siberian Yupik from St. Lawrence Island, who lives in Nome, is a member of the redistricting board. And Nicole Baromeo, who is Athabascan and from McGrath and works as a vice president at AFN, is also a member of the board. We have had Alaska Native representatives on the redistricting board before, but I don't believe that we've had this many. Having 2, it makes it sound like that's a lot, but I mean, like, what does Ruth Bader Ginsburg say? Not until there's 12. Right? Like, we have not yet had that happen for us here in Alaska, but I'm sure that's a goal we can achieve in the future. And I'm just so grateful for each of you taking time to be with us, and also for the work that you're doing. This is blistered hands kinds of work. And it's work that is about making sure that our communities can have the ability to elect people who care about us, and who know about us, and who will fight for us. And, and we don't have to convince them to give a dang about who we are and what matters to our communities, and we need that. It's also something that this process should have guaranteed from the very beginning, but it has not, and it never has. And that is a fundamental flaw with this whole process. And I think that there's greater and bigger questions that we need to be asking as well, that are outside the scope of the current Alaska redistricting process. But our Native people deserve and have a right to have equitable representation, and we never had that opportunity yet. So we want to thank you guys so much for taking time with us tonight. Wáahlaal Gíidaak, you want to share anything before we end?
Yeah, huge Shannon, for your willingness to jump on here. It's not as exciting as a census air question game show. I know Jim coming on here, but we didn't do a game show. Next time, next 10 years from now, we'll do the redistricting game show, right? So thank you all for joining us. So thankful for the work that you do. And if there's any other links that you'd like us to share, any other documents or anything else, please don't hesitate to send them our way, send contact information our way. I've been posting on our live coffee time as we go. So let me know if there's anything else. So how are going to sheesh Shannon?
Again, and thank you everyone else who's tuned into our live stream. This will be available on our Facebook page as well through First Alaskans Institute, and then we'll also be able to pull it off to the YouTube, to YouTube for folks who can watch it there easier. So we just really appreciate people tuning in and also sharing it and getting it into the hands of your community members and your leadership, and encourage people to really engage in the process, have your voice be heard. So everyone once again, and we'll see you at our next coffee time.